Dishonesty in our society, as we know, is quite an issue. But we know that, as children, you've probably heard the expression from a young age that, if somebody told you they would do something and then they decided to go back on it, they would say, well, my fingers were crossed whenever I told you that. And it's like that somehow makes it okay, but that if there was this one particular provision that was put in place, it's okay to be dishonest. And we're aware of that with, we think about the fine print that shows up in business contracts that the company might advertise, we'll never sell your information to anybody. But we define your information in this really narrow way, and we define sell as meaning this, which means when you sign the contract, it means they can sell your information to someone. And we see all kinds of things like that today, and as we continue our series in the Sermon on the Mount, we see that Jesus has already taken on several problems that the Jews had, and consequently we do as well. But we're going to continue on looking at some specifics of just exactly what did Jesus mean when he said, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And as we consider the next section, Jesus is talking about the issue of integrity. Now, as we consider what the law of Moses had to say, Jesus began this section. Again, you've heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. In this particular case, Jesus isn't directly quoting from the law, but rather he's summing up the teachings from the law from several different passages. It is a good summary of, or a good summing up of, what the law had to say about being people of integrity and what God expected. And what the law had to say about that, one good passage for us to look at would be Deuteronomy chapter 23. And we can see really the spirit of what Jesus is saying in this passage. Deuteronomy 23, beginning in verse 21, we see what the law had to say concerning keeping vows or making oaths. He said, when you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for it would be sin in you, and the Lord your God will surely require it of you. However, if you refrain from vowing, it would not be sin in you. You shall be careful to perform what goes out from your lips, just as you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised. So the law was not against oaths. So as we consider Jesus saying, take no oath at all, we're going to look at the context. Why was he saying that? But as we consider the law of Moses, it was not against oaths, but rather was against falsely swearing. It was against lying under oath or not following through on your word. As a matter of fact, as we consider the law of Moses and what it had to say about oaths, there were instances when oaths were required in certain circumstances. One example of that is seen in Exodus chapter 22, in verses 10 and following, as we see a very specific circumstance come up, and the law says that an oath is to be taken. If a man gives his neighbor a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any animal to keep for him, and it dies or is hurt or is driven away while no one is looking, an oath before the Lord shall be made by the two of them, that he has not laid his hands on his neighbor's property, and the owner shall accept it, and he shall not make restitution. And so a very specific circumstance, but it illustrates the point that the law was not against oaths. As a matter of fact, it even commanded oaths at certain times. God was not against oaths. As a matter of fact, in Acts chapter 2, verses 30 and 31, as Peter is preaching the sermon on the day of Pentecost, and speaking of David and what God's word to David was, it said that God had sworn with an oath to seat one of his descendants on his throne. God swore with an oath to David. And so God was not against oaths. He himself took oaths, allowed for oaths in the law, and even in certain circumstances commanded them. The point of the law on this subject was that God's people were to keep their word. He was against lying. He was against dishonesty. But as we consider what oaths in that day had turned into, one of the things that it reminds me of is a term that we've all seen, the terms and conditions. And that's one of those things as we consider integrity, if we're, at this point, if we're being honest, every time our phones have an update, there's this little box that it says, I've read and agreed to the terms and conditions. That's a lie every one of us have told, because that's a 1,500-page microprint document that we can somehow miraculously get through and read and agree to in about 5 seconds. But it's got all kinds of things in it that we probably wouldn't really want to agree to if we actually had read it. And as we consider oaths in the day of Jesus and what they had become, they abused the system of taking oaths in that they found loopholes out of keeping their word, like the fine print on a contract. We're not going to sell your information, but here's how we define what it means, your information. It means something very different, so it's a loophole around to where it becomes something that it really doesn't sound like it means. They had specific ways of taking oaths or taking vows in order to not keep them. They were preoccupied with the specific wording of a vow rather than the vow itself, and actually being people of integrity. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 23 and look at verses 16 and following, and we see where Jesus, at this point, as he's speaking out against the scribes and the Pharisees, against their hypocrisy, he takes on in this section the way that they were misusing vows and oaths. He says to them, "Woe to you blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, that's nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? Whoever swears by the altar, that's nothing. But whoever swears by the offering on the altar, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar swears by both the altar and everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and him who sits upon it." They held that only certain vows and oaths were binding. They could promise whatever they wanted to and then swear by the temple. And then when it came time to pay it, they would say, well, if you look at the wording in this vow that I used, if you look at the fine print of my vow, what it says is I'm not obligated to do what I told you I would do. And that's what Jesus is speaking out against here and what he's speaking about in the Sermon on the Mount. And so whenever he says in Matthew chapter 5, take no oath at all, we have to keep in context what exactly he's dealing with historically. What's been going on? Because you see, their oaths gave them a license to promise whatever. It gave them a license to lie and feel justified in it. Kind of like they felt justified in having contempt or hatred for a brother as long as they didn't murder. In the same way that they felt justified in lust as long as they don't follow through. Or they felt justified in not keeping their marriage vows, well, provided they have that little piece of paper, a certificate of divorce. In this way, as long as they worded that vow or that oath in a specific way, well, that's nothing. And that's why Jesus says here, but I say to you, take no oath at all. He's not saying that oaths are inherently sinful. When he was asked under oath whether he was the Christ in Matthew 26, he answered under oath, "You've said it yourself, and you're going to see me at the right hand of God." He's telling them to stop taking oaths because they have so corrupted the system that the oaths were doing the exact opposite of what they were intended to do. The oath was intended to be an assurance, and it had turned out to be a system where they could say whatever they wanted and it would get them out of it. Oaths had become the opposite of what they were intended to be. Jesus isn't contradicting the law, rather he's condemning the misuse and abuse of it. Don't swear by heaven or earth or Jerusalem or even by your own head. You don't control any of that. You're not sovereign over any of that. It's all under the authority of God. But what's the point? What is Jesus really driving at here? What's his point as he speaks out against the righteousness that was really lacking in the scribes and Pharisees? What's his point? But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. Or another version would say, let your yes be yes and your no be no. The point is, Jesus says, God's people are to be those who keep their word. We see that same command in James chapter 5 and verse 12. In a book that's all about, practically speaking, what does faith look like? What does Christianity look like? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ? Among other things, it means being a person of integrity. If you say you'll do something, do it. The Lord wants us to not have to take an oath in order to be believed. Let your word be as sure as an oath, is the idea. The existence of oaths evidences the dishonesty of people. Because you see, if I have to take an oath for you to believe what I say, that's evidence of the fact that I'm not generally an honest individual. But an oath isn't needed if someone is trustworthy. An oath isn't needed whenever we know that if a person tells me this, if I can trust this person to the point, if they say it, they will do it. I'm not going to ask them to put their hand on top of a Bible and say it. And if we have to put our hands on top of a Bible in order to be believed, then there's a problem. Part of the putting on the new self, Paul says to the Ephesian church, is laying aside falsehood and speaking truth to one another. That's part of what God calls us to, and that's what Jesus is calling his people to in the Sermon on the Mount. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Let your word be as sure as an oath. You shouldn't have to take an oath. But if you say it, it should be good enough. In Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 22, we read earlier, it says that lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who deal faithfully are his delight. But let's consider for just a moment this concept of lying and being truthful. Because what it comes down to, whenever we get a little bit deeper into it, is whose example are we following? In Titus chapter 1 and verse 2, the Bible tells us that God cannot lie. And we see all throughout history, whenever God promised something to his people, it was as good as done. When he would tell his people that they were to go in and go to battle, he wouldn't say, I will win this battle for you. He said, I have given them into your hands. You see, God's word was as good as already having been accomplished. Because if he made a promise, that was good enough. God cannot lie. When God gave the covenant of blessing and cursing on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, as the people of God went into, as the Israelites went into the promised land, and he gave all of these promises, if you are obedient to me, if you are faithful to me, here's all the blessings that will happen. And then he gave all of the promises, but if you are disobedient, and you go after foreign gods, and you go make alliances with other nations, and you do all these things, he says, here's what's going to happen. And in some cases, he even gave some very specific details of what would happen whenever God allowed enemies to come in and lay siege to their cities, how they would be carried off into captivity. And what we see is that whenever God's people were faithful to his word, those blessings came to pass. He gave them the land. He fulfilled his promises to bless them. But whenever they went after other foreign gods, the northern tribes were carried off into Assyrian captivity, and later the southern tribes into Babylonian captivity. We see exactly what God said coming to pass. God cannot lie. But as I mentioned, it comes down to whose example are we following? Because if you go to John chapter 8, as Jesus is having a dispute with the Jews, in John chapter 8 and verse 44, he says to them, you are of your father the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Whose example, whose influence are we going to be under? Who are we going to follow after? Are we going to follow after our God who is perfectly honest, who does not and cannot and will never tell a lie and has never told a lie? Or are we going to follow after the example of our enemy who, when he speaks a lie, he's just speaking from his nature? That's just what he does. As a matter of fact, Jesus says he's the father of lies. You might say he invented lying. Who are we going to follow after? Truthfulness, honesty, integrity makes us like our God, who always has and always will keep his word. Dishonesty makes us like our enemy. But as we consider the seriousness of this, in Revelation chapter 21 and verse 8, we find a passage that tells us just how seriously our God takes integrity, that we keep our word. In Revelation chapter 21 and verse 8, he says, "But for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." Our God takes this issue of honesty very seriously. And that means we should as well. As Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. What God is looking for is whether or not we can be trusted to do what we say. But can people trust what you say? Do we have to be bound by an oath to keep our word? Do we find loopholes and ways around doing what we said? Well, whenever I promised that, I didn't know this. But now I've learned more, and so it lets me off the hook. In Psalm 15, a very short psalm, just 5 verses long, it starts off posing the question, who's going to dwell in the presence of the Lord? Who can abide in your tent, O Lord? Who may dwell on your holy hill? Verse 2, he says, he who walks with integrity and works righteousness and speaks truth in his heart. He gets a little further down, verse 4, in whose eyes a reprobate is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord. And notice he says, he swears to his own hurt and does not change. Those who are able to dwell in the presence of the Lord are those who will keep their word even when it's difficult. Those who will keep their word even when it means that it's going to be harmful to them because they are people of integrity. Or as Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. The point of all of this is Jesus is addressing his people. He's telling them simply, do what you say you will do. To have integrity is to be like our God. It's to imitate his character, to imitate the character of our Savior. And this morning, in just a moment, we're going to offer an invitation to respond to a God who invites you to be his children, to a God who cannot lie, who's promised that whenever you respond in faith to Jesus Christ, that he will forgive and that he will save, to respond to a God who cannot lie, and we know that he will absolutely forgive and save because he said he would. And that applies to whether we're coming to him initially to become his child or if we're returning to him. He promises that when we respond in faith to forgive, to save, to put his Spirit within us. Would you accept that invitation this morning? If you're not a child of God, if you've never put Christ on in baptism, would you put your trust in Him that He will forgive you, that He will save you when you turn away from sin and you're immersed in water for the forgiveness of sins? Or if you've been wandering away from Him, He promises that if we confess, He's faithful and righteous to forgive. Do you trust Him? Would you come to Him? If we can help you in that this morning, if we can pray for you or assist you in obeying the gospel, then would you come while we stand and while we sing?